Thank you very much. For this next session, the session will be titled Plan for Forever While Building Now. What does the perfect ecosystem look like? As introduced earlier, my name is Daniel Wu. I'm from Amazon Web Services, and I'm based in Bangkok. And thank you for the opportunity to be here today as your moderator. To kick off this session and establish some context for our audiences today, I'd like to specifically speak about the term building in the title of this session. One area to do so is I'd like to borrow from my organization, Amazon. In this particular case, I'd like to talk about our distinctive pride in failure. We take particular care to be one of the best places in the world to fail. It's interesting, right? But that's only because failure and building are inseparable twins. When we build, or to invent or build, you have to experiment. And if you know in advance that it's going to work, it's not really an experiment. You're not truly building. So there's a healthy premium here to be stubborn on the vision, but flexible on the details in the long-term thinking. And consequently, because of that long-range thinking, you have to be willing to be misunderstood for a long time. So with that context in mind, it's my extreme pleasure to introduce our senior cast of speakers here today who have embraced this builder's mindset as they were searching for that ending, strategizing, logistics, and mobilizing the community, and then building for that eventual long-range ending that we're looking for. So it's my really great pleasure to introduce Mr. Brad Carr, who's an executive in digital data and analytics governance and industry engagement at NAB. I also pleased to introduce Mr. Ivan Mortimer Schutz, who's a payment specialist at the World Bank. And lastly, Mr. Yinfan Zhang, who is Director for International Public Policy and Government Affairs with Ant Group. Just like the previous session, we're going to have 5-minute podium lectures from each of our speakers first, and then we'll transition into a Q&A, during which I'd be very happy to take any questions that the audience might have for our speakers today and facilitate the discussion. So to kick us off today, very glad to introduce Brad as our first speaker, who's going to give us a banking perspective on this particular subject. Brad, over to you. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Daniel, thank you. Great to see you again. Great to reconnect in this forum after the separate AWS IIF work that we did together previously. I hope I can be a bit more engaging than a podium lecture, but thanks for setting the scene. And thanks to Camilla at the EPA and JC at DIWA and APEC for convening this important session. Daniel, I do like the point you made about experimentation and the culture of that and the value of that. But at the risk of being a little bit provocative, I'm going to start by arguing with the premise of the session's question. What does the perfect ecosystem look like? I don't know. And I don't think anyone knows. And I actually don't think we need to know. Rather, we need to let the perfect ecosystem happen. It's not so much about trying to design that perfect ecosystem, but rather about creating the conditions that will enable that to emerge. And I think if we can provide safe methods for consumers and businesses to select who they want to share their data with, and if we can provide secure vehicles for that transfer, as we were hearing in the last session about secure APIs, then I think innovative players will emerge and they'll find new opportunities and new use cases beyond anything that we can probably imagine today, and certainly beyond anything that we could try to design or construct now. And I think one of the great failings that we have today, and I say we in this sense as collectively across all of the private and public sectors, is that I think we're often still trapped in this mindset of traditional sectoral boundaries. And I think that even some of the more progressive open data regimes across the world are impacted by that constraint. Now, in calling that a failing, I want to stress that I completely empathise with the course of how we've landed there. It's understandable given the legacy regulatory constructs, the realities of legislated mandates that agencies have. For us as a firm, the legacy that we have as a bank in coming from a particular sector. But that legacy thinking is not where our customers or a country's citizenry are coming from in their expectations today and in the future. And even in Australia here, where we have our consumer data right that I think is rightly lauded for trying to go beyond just open banking and soon into energy retailing and then telcos and insurance, we're still kind of approaching this as a sequence of sectors. Whereas to the consumer, it's not their financial data and then their communications data and then their social media data. It's all their data. And so this, I say this with some humility because I'm kind of revisiting some of my earlier thinking here. I'd previously seen the sector by sector progression and thought it was all very directionally positive. And I completely understand why we in banking were really right to be the guinea pigs that would go first. But I'm coming to see that I think there's a greater urgency now in getting beyond that history, given where consumers are now at. The reality we have now across our economies and across patterns of consumer behaviour is that traditional sectoral boundaries just really don't matter anymore. And I think this has been accelerated through the pandemic, the adoption of e-commerce, the use of new telecommunications like this, the shift in entertainment preferences towards streaming, online education, increased reliance on integrated big tech platforms. And these have compounded a lot of the trends that were already happening, the gig economy, the growth of gaming and metaverse, the centrality of social media and how we interact. Incidentally, just to do a bit of cross-promotion, we've got a new podcast out today with DeepView's CEO and founder, Catherine Parry. She talks about the serotonin boost that people get from social media and the security vulnerabilities that opens up. My point is that none of these things are happening in isolation. We're in a very interconnected world, integrated world across the different walks of life and the different parts of a small business's activities, and a world in which we really have embedded finance and banking as a service. And so for us as a bank, and I think probably reflective across the industry writ large, we don't operate in a vacuum. Our customers want integrated service delivery, and we and others like us and others that might be different to us but competing against us, we all know that we need to bring that integrated delivery to our customers. It's the reality of what they've come to expect from their heightened experiences. So I think open banking is a bit of a redundant way of thinking. And I think the same is true for open electricity or open any other sector. And we really need to get beyond that incrementalism if we're really going to achieve those economic and consumer outcomes that open data makes possible. I think framing it in terms of sectors, maybe we need to instead frame it in terms of the data sets that might have value for others elsewhere that can innovate elsewhere in the economy. I love the example that was published in the US by the FDIC on research from Manju Puri at Duke University, where they modelled creditworthiness using all the sort of traditional credit bureau metrics that we use at a bank: income, repayment history, the asset base, etc. And then they modelled it on the same customers on their digital footprint. What kind of operating system you use, what time of day you logged in, whether you typed all in capitals, whether you used your work email address or your Gmail. Well, they found that digital footprint was actually a little bit more accurate. But where you got a real quantum leap uplift was when you could put those things together, both the traditional credit bureau metrics and these others. So I think we need the consumer having the ability to take their data wherever they wish, whether that's those sort of metrics I mentioned, whether it's their social media networks, their browsing history. It should be the consumer's choice and for them to decide who they want to trust and who they want to share that with. So,
Brad,
conscious.
I'm sorry to cut you off.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Mr. Brad. I'm so sorry. Let's pick up on this. I think in the Q&A, I think you expanded on the point about sector by sector incrementalism doesn't work, and I think we're going to pick up right back on that in the Q&A section. Let's transition just a little bit, building on what Brad had shared earlier, and I'd like to invite Ivan, who now is going to talk to us a little bit from a cross-sector perspective. Ivan, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me all right? Yes?
Yes.
I'm on two devices. Yeah. Okay. So maybe I'll just try and highlight a few points, because this is indeed a really vast space that I think policymakers are finding increasingly complex, and in which really we need to see, I think, open banking and open finance initiatives today as just one, as many speakers mentioned, very early stage, but quite well structured approach to the broader issue of how we mobilize data and adjust to the new economic circumstances that we're all really encountering, where not just consumers, but also businesses and government need to be able to do more with data in an interoperable, secure, and productive manner. And so we're really on a dynamic journey, which is going to have several stages of evolution, where perhaps data that is now important for us will gradually, like in many economic processes, diminish in terms of its marginal contribution to productivity. But then as that happens, other data sets will become more scarce, more meaningful as we increase productivity and new business models. So maybe just highlighting a couple of issues, along the theme that you brought out. So indeed, first of all, we are crossing more and more sectors, and I'll give you a few examples. I think from a policy perspective, it's important to highlight that we're crossing these traditional boundaries of different regulatory and government authorities, as well as industry authorities, if you like. And of course, crucially, this is becoming very, very quickly an international market. And that raises a couple of implications, which I hope I can kind of quickly point to before my 5 minutes are up. So in terms of broader sectors, I think, as was earlier mentioned, we look at this a lot through the financial sector because the financial sector actually permeates every element of economic activity. But we're seeing that the issues that we're raising are not just of importance for consumers, they're important for businesses. I think in a lot of the emerging markets that we deal with, it's a really big issue for the gray zone of informal businesses that have perhaps an identity, but they don't have an identity which enables them to encompass their private lives and their corporate lives. And I agree that that's a linchpin or sort of foundation stone that many markets need to deal with. We see data in the area of things like logistics, healthcare, accounting systems, of course, sales mechanisms. All of these areas of the economy are looking at how they mobilize data, primary data that belongs clearly to somebody, secondary metadata, analytics that sit on top of that. All of that data is looking at how it can be mobilized. And crucially across these sectors, the key issue, as we see also in the UK history, is there a market failure or is there a constriction on the market access or ability to use and share data? Or is that already a market which is quite well structured and open? And I think that the answer to that question often changes by sector and by country. Secondly, I think that the big challenge that we're all going to have to confront is indeed how authorities in different sectors work together. Because as Brad pointed out, the real economy does not really respect these historical boundaries that we've been used to. The banking sector or the financial sector is typically one in which those boundaries have been very, very clearly defined, and the powers have been in particular very strong, but other sectors have those same, increasingly have regulators or authorities that cover their issues, and everybody is dealing with how to coordinate. The third issue is, of course, international. This is going to become and has become a very broad international domain where different countries need to work together. And I think the crucial issue we're encountering already is governance. If we are going to rely on and promote open standards and industry collaboration to look at this not just through a domestic lens, but internationally, how do we engage or develop a governance structure that gives different countries of different historical weighting and economic importance the right buy-in to standards that may eventually have a very significant impact on authorities' ability to govern the market, to police the market, to gain access to the market. And all of these sorts of issues are raising...
I'm so sorry.
Okay.
The 5-minute bell has also rung for you.
Right.
Ivan, thank you. I like that you spoke about the different strata of industries and countries, and we're going to come back to that, I think, in the Q&A. So let's save the best for last. So now let me turn the floor over to Yin-Fan, who's going to give us a platform perspective. Yin-Fan, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I think Braden and Ivan already touched my points, but I would like to maybe restate from a platform perspective, because I do agree, the openness and there's no perfect ecosystem at all, the points they have been made. And I want to raise and ask you to focus on two next. One is the openness and one is the connectivity. I think when we talk about open data, especially, concerning the policy environment, we tend to describe a policy environment as being either lack of clarity or, on the other hand, too many restrictions with limited openness. But I think there's, as Brad mentioned, there's no perfect system. So I think both extreme actually reflect the unique nature of data and the digital economy, which is built upon the usage of data. And let's compare data, their nature, to conventional assets or raw materials. I think it is difficult to define the nature of data as raw materials in different user cases. And the nature of data asks us to do things constantly differently. I think policy possibilities change as the technology develops. And sometimes private sector business could get this well ahead policymakers. However, on the other hand, the lack of regulation will not support an open and fair playground for competition, while too much interference from policymakers will limit the innovation and creativity from the market. But things could be easier if we examine the entire balance or dynamic from not a snapshot point of view, but a developing evolving perspective. So policymaker could design the framework with openness and allow the space for, flexibility and space for modification by very close and open interaction with business and tech drivers like us, like exactly what we are doing now, while business will forge a close interaction with policymakers, where they could also follow the trends and the social policy trends from a more macro perspective, while it's trying their best to innovate. Because the harder we innovate, the better products and services we will be able to provide to our clients and the society as a whole. So I want to state that the entire process should not be one-off. It should be on an evolving process, and there's only the beginning and there's no end to this interaction of the continuous interaction. And this interaction, I think, form the foundation of an enabling ecosystem, which is the topic we are discussing today. And the other point is about connectivity. I think that brings back to Ivan's point on the boundary between different, sectors. And I think openness is one hand, but the connectivity between these sectors is also a key part, especially for a platform perspective. Because again, back to the fundamental nature of data, we can understand the way how the society is organized and how the industry are organized, because it is designed based on the category of different raw materials, final product or services, but they are conventional materials. While data and technology advance sometimes break the boundary and requires more cross-sectoral usage of data, which enables tech innovation. Let's take an example from Arms Group. And a data collected based on consumer behavior could be easily converted into a carbon emission report and therefore be used as an underlying source for green credit evaluation. While Earth scanning by satellite on agriculture fields, the Fidelity Nutritious could also help predict the agriculture harvest and help design catastrophic insurance schemes. However, by far, these data are regulated by different governmental bodies, whether Industrial and Trade Promotion Bureau, financial regulators, agriculture, or environmental ministries. There are not natural boundaries in tech for these data, but actually artificial borders made by men ourselves. So it would be ideal if there will be an overarching collaboration between different social departments, governmental departments, business departments, and we prioritize these collaboration under the flag of tech innovation, which will direct to the entire well-being of our society. And such a vision.
I'm gonna ring the bell and cut you
no
off 5 minutes. Yes, look, thank you so much for sharing that. I like the part where you said collaboration and the fact that this is a journey rather than articulating a destination. And I'm going to come back to that. I just love to pick your brains in your perspective as a public policy leader. So thank you very much, Brad, Ivan, Yin-Fan, for giving us a perspective from your point of view in your world on this particular topic and setting the context for the remainder Q&A. Again, I'd like to invite the audience to please post your questions in the chat, and then I will tee them up to the speakers. So for the Q&A, we do have some questions that have already been discussed, and let's do in reverse order. Was it reverse order? Yes. So Brad, that would be you first. Brad, the part where you mentioned about the sector by sector sequence doesn't make sense. To me, it kind of runs into Ivan's point that the fact that FSI, financial services, cuts across literally every industry. So the role of the banks remains crucial, no matter where we go, at least from now until the short to medium term. So as banks play a linchpin in the evolutionary arc to enable open banking, then open data set ecosystems, can you help us understand from your point of view, and then kind of marry that with what Ivan said, how would the role of the bank themselves evolve in this journey? Is it a bit more of the same, or is it something entirely new and yet to unfold?
Well, that's a great open-ended question you've just thrown me there, Daniel. I think that the role of the banks, can be, and this depends on the firm's own strategy and its own capabilities, but banks can emerge as perhaps data hubs or trusted verifiers of data. And certainly this is somewhere where we see our banks here in Australia, but also ahead of us in Canada and in the Scandinavian countries, have seen the opportunities with digital identity. There's a lot of data points you can look to, and I think they were alluded to in our prior session, that there was the Bank of England's Future of Finance report in 2019 that I think when asked who they most trust with their personal data, 84% of people said their banks. The other 16 scattered across a range of other sectoral residents. There was the BIS report just over a year ago that called out quite consistently across all sorts of demographics that people trusted their bank more than they trusted their government, more than they trusted their tech firm with their private data. So I think there are opportunities for banks to leverage that trust. Now, of course, trust is only great so long as you have it and so long as you live up to it. And it's absolutely critically important, and it's a real focus for us to ensure that we have frameworks in place that we continue to be ethical and transparent and secure in the way that we use and transfer customer data. So I think that's absolutely crucial to anything that we might leverage. If I can add one more point, Daniel, and I think, I've talked there a bit about the cross-sectoral viewpoint, but I think also we need to not constrain our thinking with existing use cases. And it's something that we do a bit of internally within a bank, and we look at what new investments we might make using some of these data sources, and we talk a bit about what's the use case. But we also see it when some of our engagements with government, and government wants to see what the use case would be before perhaps extending some of the reach of open data into other sectors. The reality is that a lot of the use cases that are going to be really relevant in 5 or 10 years' time are things that we just don't know now. It takes me back a bit to the old Henry Ford adage about, if I went and asked customers what they wanted, they would have told me they wanted a faster horse. I think we need to just have that, be cognizant that if we just limit ourselves to thinking of the use cases of what we do today, then we're only ever going to be a little bit better or more efficient at doing what we already do. Whereas there are a lot of other opportunities out there that we might be able to do them. It might be other more innovative and nimble players than a bank. It might be things that we can do in partnership with some of those more nimble players. But, I think we need to leave that opportunity open, that we are able to pursue some of these things that we can't imagine at the moment. And I think that's the only way that you're really going to enable customer empowerment and productivity growth.
Brad, that's a really great point. And in fact, it's a great segue to a question from the audience, which I think I'll direct to you. And I think Yin Fan, you might be interested to answer this too. The question goes, what is the investment model and commercialization model in place as there are many stakeholders from various sectors? Would you like to give that a stab? Oh, Ivan, please weigh in too.
Yeah, did you want me to start?
Yeah, Brad, would you like to go first? Yeah.
Look, I don't know that there's a singular investment model or commercialization model. I think there's probably several, and again, to the point, I don't want to be constraining or focused on an individual one. I guess one observation I'd make, and I'm probably drawing more on my IIF history here. Banks have customers. Banks have significant customer bases, have significant customer franchises. That's one of our core strengths. We are not always terribly nimble and agile firms for a variety of reasons, both in terms of legacy, in terms of our risk consciousness and our governance controls that people like me oversee, etc., and get in the way and interfere. On the other hand, a lot of the more nimble firms have all of the great ideas, the great technology. They don't have the starting point of having a significant customer base with which to work. So I find that is often a fairly natural opportunity for collaboration where those interests align. But most importantly, where we can each make our interests align with the customer's interests. Because ultimately, if you want to have a sustainable business, that's what you got to do.
Thank you, Brad. Lovely. So let's move on to the next question then. Ivan, coming back to you. So before we had to ring the bell on the 5 minutes, you were just touching on that important point of different countries, different sectors, not quite the same in terms of priorities, and therefore there is some kind of strata there. So talk to us more about that, and then if you think about what are some early groundwork that we can start laying today to perhaps reduce some of those barriers that we have created, like Yin Fan was saying, like man, that we impose as man on ourselves, and then how do we overcome some of that? Over to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So I think the point I think that we need to look at is that this is not about one ecosystem, but it's a multiplicity of different ecosystems with different actors and data. And therefore, we should be expecting to see different, I would call them architectural models emerge. In fact, we already have a multiplicity of architecture models when we think about who are the data subjects, who are the companies or institutions that are creating the data, how does the data get modified, how do we regulate or not access and usage. And we have some very familiar models. We have hub and spoke models. We have bilateral arrangements. So, some of these pictures came up earlier on in Ralph's presentation. And we have increasingly federated models, which open banking is arguably one example of, where we're extending access, but to data that there. And then we have a sort of an emerging area of much more distributed models, which are also being experimented with, among others, in Singapore. And I think we're also going to see the emergence of models whereby data subjects themselves own and actually have operational control over their data, just almost in the way that, if I get a paper statement of my bank account, I can take that piece of paper wherever the physical world allows me to go. But if I can do the same thing with my digital data, then we end up putting a lot more control and direction in the hands of the consumers. And I think that's what's going to drive, it's that diversity of architecture coupled with the different problems we're trying to solve for. In other words, how do I get more access to credit bureau data? May need a very different answer than what do I do to better manage healthcare data, or to the point about the ecological footprint. So each of these different data sets and circumstances may require a different governance structure because the risks and the access rights are different. The architectural approach may be different because we're starting from a different point in terms of who owns the data and who wants access. And that's what I meant when I said that the open banking approach we see at the moment within the finance sector is we're one species within a growing, quite diverse, ecosystem in which we should expect to see a multiplicity.
Thank you very much, Ivan. That's super helpful. And just to deep dive a little bit to wrap things up, do you see that these different architectures meeting together, melding together in the future, or is it too early to tell? What do you think?
I think de facto they already do melt together, but in the sense that they're going to be forced to, and they already are forced to support economies that are de facto integrated. The question is, in each of these different areas of the economy, what frictions are we creating? Every time we create a standard, it helps to create interoperability. It helps to broaden the ecosystem, create larger economies of scale. But de facto, as Ralph was pointing out, it does cost time and money and energy to take what you have today and move over to a new or different standard. So we need to be cognizant of what are these additional frictions we're creating, and are we managing them in a way which overall is leading to a better outcome, or are we inadvertently, as you might say, balkanizing sectors and countries around new lines? And I think that's what everybody's conscious of, for example, in Southeast Asia at the moment, is that, well, we don't want to inadvertently create different standards or regulatory frameworks that actually make it more difficult than it is today for these kinds of new and innovative services to scale across the region, for example.
Thank you very much, Ivan. Thank you very much for clarifying on that point. That's really good, really great stuff. In the remaining time, I'd like to ask Yin Fan to take the final question and bring us home to wrap up this conversation. So actually building on the session one, prior to ours, we heard about the importance of the policy environment. And likewise, we heard from Brad and Ivan about the role of policy architectures affecting how the industry itself will have to agilely innovate and figure out a path forward. So in your day job as Director for Public Policy at Ant Group, love to get your feedback and views on this particular question. So we already heard that we have to thrive within a successful and enabling policy environment. From your point of view, what does that look like? What are some of the blockers in place today? And then what advice do you have in terms of how we can engage regulators to shape that foundation?
Thanks, Daniel. I'll be quick. I think we are the fact that we are having this conversation now with the group of EPAA and many of the other workshops we are doing with the regulator is already a sign of actually there is an enabling policy environment at the moment. And at least in Asia Pacific, I think most of our governments and regulators, they're very keen to engage with business. And for Ant, we have been speaking to many of them and exploring what they're going to do and how we could participate individually or with different members or via industry bodies. So I think the dialogue is already happening. And in terms of what will be a good or what will be an enabling environment, I already mentioned in my sharing, which is an environment of openness and also an environment of connectivity. And if we have these standards or these targets, I think tech will evolve by itself, and tech will bring and convert into the industrial and regulatory transformation, and that help in competition. And if that's in a open market, it's in a competitive market, I think tech itself will speak, and tech itself will drive the industry to go. As long as we are going towards the well-being for the for human being, for the society, I think that's what we should bear in mind, and that's the policymaker and statesmen should think about. But for us as a platform, we are very keen to engage with government and with the policymakers to make that dialogue happen and make sure the channel is smooth.
Yin Fan, thank you very much. I love that you basically brought us to this close, focusing on let's stay grounded on shared values. And I think that's really the theme that has been permeating throughout the conversation today. So we now come to the end of this session. I'd just like to ask our audience to please join me in thanking Brad, Ivan, and Yin Fan for very generously sharing their perspectives on the topic today, which is about planning forever while building now, what the perfect ecosystem could look like. So thank you very much, gentlemen.